The explosion threw Elena Martinez face first into the mud, her medical kit scattering across the torn earth like confetti at a funeral. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear them screaming, not the enemy, but her own squad mates. The same men who'd spent the last 3 months mocking her soft heart and questioning whether a medic who couldn't watch war movies belonged in a combat zone. Medic! Medic! The desperate cry cut through the acrid smoke billowing from the demolished checkpoint. Elena pushed herself up on shaking arms, tasting copper and dirt. 20 yards ahead, through the haze, she could see the twisted metal remains of what had been their transport vehicle. Bodies lay scattered around it like broken dolls, some still moving, others terrifyingly still. Sergeant Morrison's voice boomed across the chaos. "Martinez, get your ass over here. We've got men down." Elena's hands trembled as she gathered her scattered supplies. This was it, the moment every medic trained for but hoped would never come. The theoretical became brutally real as she forced her legs to carry her toward the wounded, each step bringing her closer to the kind of carnage that would haunt her dreams for years to come. But as she ran, something shifted inside her chest. The fear was still there, sharp and cold, but underneath it burned something fiercer, the absolute certainty that she would not let these men die. Not today. Not on her watch. The minefield stretched before them like a deadly puzzle, and 8 wounded soldiers lay bleeding in its embrace, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to come get them. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching. Creating and narrating these detailed, novel-length stories takes tremendous time and research to bring you the most engaging content possible. We're embarking on a journey of nearly 50,000 words together. That's a full novella. If you're already hooked by what you've heard, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing the story with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. This is going to be an epic adventure, so get comfortable. And let's continue with this remarkable tale. 3 months earlier, Elena Martinez had arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel with butterflies in her stomach and doubt in her heart. At 24, she was older than most new recruits, having spent 6 years working as a civilian paramedic in Chicago before enlisting. The transition from saving lives on city streets to preparing for war zones had been jarring enough, but nothing had prepared her for the skeptical stares of Alpha Squad. Another bleeding heart. She'd overheard Corporal Jake "Tank" Thompson whisper to his buddy, Private First Class Rick Santos, as she'd unpacked her gear in the cramped quarters. She'd been assigned. That she doesn't last 2 weeks before requesting a transfer to the rear. Elena had pretended not to hear, focusing instead on arranging her medical supplies with meticulous care. Each bandage, each medication, each piece of equipment had its place organization that might mean the difference between life and death when seconds counted. But even as her hands worked automatically, her mind churned with the familiar anxiety that had plagued her since basic training. The truth was, Tank wasn't entirely wrong. Elena did have what her grandmother had always called a soft heart, an inability to witness suffering without feeling compelled to act. It had driven her to become a paramedic, guided her through countless midnight emergencies, and ultimately led her to enlist when she'd realized that soldiers needed medics who cared as much about saving lives as others cared about taking them. But in the harsh reality of military life, her compassion was seen as weakness. When she'd quietly excused herself from the squad's movie night because they'd chosen a particularly graphic war film, the teasing had begun in earnest. When she'd been caught feeding stray cats that had wandered into the base perimeter, nicknamed Soft Heart had stuck like shrapnel. Martinez. Sergeant First Class David Morrison's bark cut through her memories. At 38, Morrison was a career soldier with 2 deployments under his belt and little patience for what he perceived as weakness. His weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into hostile territory, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing. "You're with us on patrol. Grab your kit." Elena's stomach dropped. This would be her first patrol outside the wire, her first real test. She'd spent weeks training for this moment, memorizing every procedure, practicing every scenario. But the reality of leaving the relative safety of the base felt like stepping off a cliff. The squad assembled in the motor pool as the sun crested. The horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful in any other context. Besides Morrison and herself, Alpha Squad consisted of 6 other soldiers. Tank Thompson, a mountain of a man from Texas who served as their heavy weapons specialist. Rick Santos, a wiry kid from Los Angeles who'd grown up fast in the Army. Private Marcus "Doc" Williams, the squad's communications specialist and Elena's closest thing to a friend. Staff Sergeant Ashley Chun, a tough-as-nails woman who served as Morrison's second-in-command. Private Tony "Razor" Kowalski, a demolitions expert, with a nervous laugh. And Private First Class James "Crow" Blackwood, their designated marksman whose quiet intensity made everyone slightly uncomfortable. "Listen up," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily across the small group. Intelligence reports increased. Insurgent activity in Sector 7. We're doing a routine patrol, checking on the local checkpoints, but stay sharp. The situation's been fluid lately, and I don't want any surprises. Elena adjusted the weight of her medical pack, feeling the familiar bulk of supplies against her back. She'd modified the standard loadout, adding extra trauma bandages and morphine. Based on her civilian experience, Morrison had initially objected, claiming the extra weight would slow her down. But Chun had overruled him with a terse observation that having too many medical supplies was a problem they could live with. "Martinez," Morrison continued, his gaze fixing on her. "This isn't a drill anymore. Out there, people shoot back. You think you can handle that?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Elena felt every eye on her, waiting for her response. Part of her wanted to snap back with something tough and defiant, but that wasn't who she was. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "I can handle whatever I need to handle, Sergeant." Tank snorted. "We'll see about that, soft heart." The convoy consisted of 2 MRA Peas mine-resistant vehicles designed to withstand improvised explosive devices. Elena found herself in the second vehicle with Doc, Razor, and Crow, while Morrison, Chun, Tank, and Santos took the lead vehicle. The ride through the base's protective barriers marked a psychological transition as much as a physical one. Beyond, the wire lay a landscape of brown hills and sparse vegetation, punctuated by small villages and the occasional patrol route. Doc, whose real name was Marcus Williams, had been the first to show Elena any real kindness since her arrival. A communications specialist from Detroit, he'd served 2 previous deployments and had developed what Elena recognized as a medic's understanding of human frailty, an ability to see past the tough exterior to the vulnerable person underneath. "First, patrol's always the worst," he said quietly, adjusting his radio headset. "After this, it's just another day at the office." "You nervous?" Razor asked, his voice carrying that edge of forced casualness that masked his own anxiety. Tony Kowalski was 22, from a Polish neighborhood in Chicago that Elena actually knew well. His specialty was explosives, but his real talent was for dark humor that helped the squad cope with the constant tension. "Terrified," Elena admitted, earning a surprised look from Crow, who rarely spoke but seemed to respect honesty. "But I'd rather be terrified and useful than terrified and useless." "That's the spirit," Doc grinned. "Just remember, out here we're all afraid of something. The trick is not letting it make your decisions for you." The first checkpoint was a small outpost manned by local security forces, part of the ongoing effort to transfer responsibility to indigenous troops. The meeting was routine status reports, Equipment checks. A brief discussion of recent incidents. Elena found herself studying the faces of the local soldiers, trying to read the tension in their postures, the wariness in their eyes. These men lived with the constant threat of insurgent attacks, never knowing which day might be their last dot as they prepared to leave the checkpoint. Elena noticed a young local soldier favoring his left leg. Her medic instincts kicked in immediately. "Sergeant Morrison," she called out, approaching the squad leader. "That soldier there has an injury. I'd like to take a look." Morrison followed her gaze, his expression skeptical. "It's not our problem, Martinez. We're not running a charity medical clinic. It'll take 5 minutes," Elena pressed. "If he's injured and can't perform his duties, it affects the security of this checkpoint. That makes it our problem." For a moment, Morrison stared at her, and Elena thought he might refuse. But Chun spoke up from beside him. "She's got a point, Sarge. Injured friendly forces are a liability we can prevent." With a frustrated sigh, Morrison nodded. 5 minutes. "Martinez, that's it." The young soldier, whose name was Halil, had stepped on a piece of rusty metal 3 days earlier. The wound had become infected, and he'd been trying to hide it rather than report to his superiors and risk being sent home to his family without pay. Elena cleaned and dressed the wound, administered antibiotics from her personal supply, and gave Halil instructions for follow-up care. "Thank you," he said in careful English, his gratitude genuine and touching. As they walked back to the vehicles, Tank shook his head. "There you go again, Softheart, using our supplies on people who aren't even our responsibility." "Those supplies are meant to save lives," Elena replied evenly. "I don't see how saving his life is any different from saving yours, because he's not one of us," Santos chimed in. "Out here, you take care of your own first." The argument might have continued, but Morrison cut it short with a sharp command to mount up. As the convoy rolled toward their next checkpoint, Elena found herself staring out at the landscape and wondering if her squad mates would ever understand that her compassion wasn't weakness. It was the very thing that made her effective at her job. The second checkpoint told a different story. The building had been damaged by a recent mortar attack, its walls pockmarked with shrapnel holes. The local commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Rashid, reported increased insurgent probing attacks over the past week. Intelligence suggested a major assault was being planned, though the timing remained unclear. "They test our defenses," Rashid explained through an interpreter, his weathered hands sketching diagrams in the dust. "Small groups, quick strikes. Then they disappear. They learn our patterns." Morrison studied the tactical situation with professional interest. The checkpoint commanded a crucial intersection of 2 supply routes, making it a strategic target. If it fell, insurgent forces would have a clear path to disrupt coalition operations throughout the region. "What do you need?" Morrison asked. "Men, ammunition, medical supplies," Rashid replied without hesitation. "But most of all, we need to know someone cares if we live or die." Elena felt that last comment hit her like a physical blow. These men were fighting the same war, facing the same dangers, yet they felt abandoned and forgotten. She found herself looking at their equipment, outdated weapons, insufficient body armor, medical supplies that were clearly inadequate for the threats they faced. "Sergeant," she said quietly, approaching Morrison as he concluded his discussion with Rashid, "I'd like to leave some medical supplies here. Basic trauma supplies, antibiotics, pain medication. Their medic has almost nothing to work with." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Martinez, those supplies are for our squad. What happens if we need them later?" "Then we'll make do," Elena replied. "But these men are fighting and dying for the same cause we are. Leaving them without proper medical support when we have excess supplies isn't just cruel, it's strategically stupid. Dead allies can't hold checkpoints." Shun, who had been listening to the exchange, stepped closer. "She's right, Sarge. Command's been pushing for better relations with local forces. This is the kind of goodwill gesture that pays dividends. After a long moment, Morrison nodded reluctantly. Basic supplies only, Martinez. Don't go overboard. Elena spent the next 20 minutes working with the checkpoint's medic, a young man named Ferris who had learned his skills through brutal necessity rather than formal training. She showed him advanced wound treatment techniques, explained proper antibiotic usage, and left him with supplies that doubled his available resources. "You are different from other Americans," Ferris said as she prepared to leave. "Most soldiers see only enemies or tools. You see people." The comment stayed with Elena as the convoy continued its patrol route. Tank and Santos continued their muttered complaints about her bleeding heart tendencies, but she noticed that Doc and even Crow seemed thoughtful about what they'd witnessed. Perhaps her approach was getting through to someone. The third checkpoint was their final stop, a remote outpost that served as early warning for insurgent movement from the hills. The garrison was smaller here, just 8 men holding a position that should have been defended by twice that number. Their commander, Lieutenant Hakim, was barely older than Elena but carried himself with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much combat. "No incidents to report," Hakim said when Morrison asked for his situation update. But Elena could see the lie in his eyes, the way his men looked away when questioned. Something had happened here. Something they didn't want to report through official channels. As Morrison and Chun conducted their inspection, Elena found herself drawn to a young soldier who was sitting alone, staring out at the surrounding hills. With unfocused eyes, she recognized the signs immediately: shock, trauma, the 1,000-yard stare that came after witnessing something terrible. "What's your name?" she asked gently, sitting down beside him. "Ahmad," he replied without looking at her. "What happened, Ahmad?" For a long moment he was silent. Then, in halting English mixed with Arabic that she partially understood from her language training, he told her about the patrol that had gone out 2 days earlier. They'd found evidence of an insurgent weapons cache in a nearby cave system, but when they'd investigated, it had been a trap. An improvised explosive device had killed 2 men and wounded 3 others. The survivors had been forced to carry their casualties back to the checkpoint under fire, a running battle that had lasted for hours. "We left Mohammed behind," Ahmad whispered, his voice breaking. "The insurgents took his body. His family will never have peace." Elena felt her heart clench with sympathy. She understood now why Hakim hadn't reported the incident. Losing soldiers and equipment reflected poorly on commanders, and there was always pressure to minimize casualties in official reports. But the psychological cost of such cover-ups was devastating for the men who lived with the guilt. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly. "I could have gone back for him," Ahmad insisted. "I could have saved him. And then there would have been 2 bodies for the insurgents to take," Elena replied. "You made the choice that kept the rest of your unit alive. Mohammed wouldn't want you to carry guilt for that." She spent another 10 minutes with Ahmad, listening to his pain and offering what comfort she could. It wasn't much. She couldn't bring back his friend or erase the trauma, but sometimes being heard was enough to begin healing. When Morrison called for departure, Elena felt a familiar reluctance to leave. These men were facing the same dangers as her squad, but with fewer resources and less support. The inequality felt wrong, a betrayal of the brotherhood that was supposed to exist among all soldiers fighting the same war. The convoy's return journey to base was uneventful, but Elena found herself processing everything she'd seen and heard. The local forces weren't just allies of convenience. They were human beings with families, dreams and fears identical to her own. Treating them as expendable wasn't just morally wrong. It was tactically foolish. "So how was your first patrol?" "Soft heart?" Tank asked as they dismounted at the motor pool. "Educational," Elena replied simply. That evening, as she sat in the mess hall picking at her dinner, Doc joined her at the table. Heard you made quite an impression at the checkpoints. Today, I just did my job. That's not how Morrison tells it, Doc said with a grin. According to him, you turned a routine patrol into a humanitarian mission. Elena looked up, suddenly worried. Am I in trouble? Nah, Doc shook his head. Chun backed you up. Said you showed good judgment and tactical thinking. But Morrison's concerned about your attachment to the locals. My attachment to keeping allies alive, you mean? Hey, I'm not criticizing. Doc raised his hands defensively. I think what you did was right. But this is a small unit, Elena. We depend on each other completely. Morrison's job is to make sure we all come home alive, and he's worried that your instinct to help everyone might put the squad at risk. Elena considered this carefully. What do you think? I think, Doc said slowly, that your soft heart might be exactly what this squad needs. But you're going to have to prove that caring about others doesn't make you a liability in combat. And that's going to take time. As if summoned by their conversation, Tank appeared at their table, dropping his tray with deliberate force. Mind if I join the Bleeding Hearts Club meeting? Sure, Elena replied evenly. We were just discussing the tactical advantages of keeping Allied forces combat effective through proper medical support. Tank snorted. You can dress it up in fancy words all you want, Softheart, but what you're really doing is playing favorites with people who aren't part of our team. That's dangerous thinking in a combat zone. Everyone fighting the same enemy is part of our team, Elena countered. The only dangerous thinking is the kind that writes off potential allies because they weren't born in the same country as us. Pretty words, Tank said, leaning back in his chair. Let's see how pretty they sound when the shooting starts, and you have to choose between saving one of us or saving one of them. The challenge hung in the air between them, impossible to answer with words alone. Elena realized that Tank was voicing the squad's fundamental concern about her, that when the ultimate test came, her compassion might be indiscriminate, that she might fail to prioritize her own unit's survival. I guess we'll find out, she said quietly. Tank studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Yeah, he said finally. I guess we will. The next morning brought new orders. Alpha Squad would be conducting extended patrols in Sector 7. For the next 2 weeks, based out of Checkpoint Charlie, the remote outpost they'd visited the day before. The intelligence picture had worsened overnight, with multiple sources reporting insurgent forces massing for a major offensive. Elena packed her gear with extra care, knowing that resupply would be limited during their extended deployment. She included additional medical supplies, ignoring Tank's pointed comments about playing favorites. If they were going to be working closely with local forces, she wanted to be prepared for any medical emergencies that might arise. The convoy that carried them to Checkpoint Charlie was larger this time, including additional ammunition, communications equipment, and supplies for the extended mission. Elena found herself riding with Chen, who used the journey to brief her on the tactical situation. The checkpoint's in a vulnerable position, Chen explained, pointing to a map. Good fields of fire, but limited escape routes if they get overrun. The locals have been holding it for 6 months, but they've lost a third of their original garrison to casualties and desertions. What about reinforcements? Stretched thin, Chen admitted. Every unit in the region is dealing with increased insurgent activity. For the next 2 weeks, we're all they've got. The checkpoint looked different. In daylight, smaller, more isolated, more fragile than Elena had realized during their brief visit. The defensive positions were well constructed, but clearly designed by men who understood that they might have to fight to the death defending this patch of barren ground. Lieutenant Hakim greeted them with obvious relief. The presence of American soldiers would boost his men's morale and provide crucial heavy weapons support if the expected attack materialized. But Elena could see the strain in his face, the weight of command that came with knowing that decisions made in the next few days might determine who lived and who died. Alpha Squad set up their positions with professional efficiency, integrating their defensive fire with the existing positions held by local forces. Tank positioned his heavy machine gun to provide covering fire for the checkpoint's most vulnerable approaches, while Crow found an elevated position that gave him long-range fields of fire. Santos and Razor worked together to improve the defensive positions, adding sandbags and reinforcing weak points in the perimeter. Elena established her aid station in the checkpoint's most protected bunker, combining her supplies with those of Ferris, the local medic. Working together, they inventoried available resources and planned for various casualty scenarios. Elena was impressed by Ferris's improvisation skills. He'd learned to make do with limited supplies, creating effective treatments from materials that American medics would have discarded. "You have much to learn from us," Ferris said with a shy smile, "and we have much to learn from you. Together, we are stronger." The first 3 days passed quietly, with routine patrols and equipment maintenance occupying most of their time. Elena found herself working closely with the local soldiers, treating minor injuries and illnesses while building relationships that she hoped would prove valuable if combat came. She learned their names, their stories, their fears about families. Left behind in distant villages. Ahmad, the young soldier she'd spoken with during their first visit, became a frequent visitor to her aid station. His trauma from the failed patrol was healing slowly, but Elena could see improvement in his confidence and focus. She began teaching him basic medical techniques, reasoning that every soldier who could provide first aid was a force multiplier. "In combat, you trust me to learn this?" Ahmad asked during one of their sessions, his surprise evident. "Of course," Elena replied. "Medical knowledge belongs to everyone who might need to save a life." Morrison watched these interactions with growing concern. During their daily briefings, he repeatedly questioned Elena's priorities and warned about operational security. But his objections were muted by the obvious improvement in cooperation between American and local forces. "The locals are more willing to share intelligence," Chun reported during their third evening briefing. "Martinez's medical assistance has built real goodwill. They're starting to trust us." "Trust doesn't stop bullets," Morrison replied grimly. "And all this fraternization could be a security risk. How do we know one of these guys isn't feeding information to the insurgents?" It was a valid concern, Elena knew. Insurgent infiltration of local forces was a constant threat, and the personal relationship she'd been building could potentially be exploited by enemy agents. But the alternative, treating local allies as potential enemies, seemed equally dangerous. "We don't know," she admitted. "But we also don't know that they're not. At some point, you have to take calculated risks based on your assessment of character." "Character assessment," Tank muttered. "That's a luxury we can't afford out here." "Soft heart." The argument was interrupted by Doc's radio crackling to life with an urgent transmission from Base Command. Intelligence had detected large-scale insurgent movement in their sector. An attack on their position was now considered imminent, possibly within the next 24 hours. Morrison's demeanor shifted immediately from skeptical to focused. "All right, people. This is what we've been preparing for. Chun, I want defensive positions reinforced by dawn. Tank, check your fields of fire and ammunition supply. Santos, Razor, I want every approach to this position covered with overlapping fire. Doc, make sure communications are solid. We're going to need artillery and air support if this goes bad." "What about me?" Elena asked. Morrison looked at her. "Seriously, you're going to find out what kind of medic you really are, Martinez. When the shooting starts, everything changes. Your soft heart might get people killed." Elena felt the familiar flutter of fear in her stomach, but underneath it was something else, a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. "Then I guess I'd better make sure it saves them instead." As the squad prepared for battle, Elena found herself thinking about the men she'd come to know over the past 3 days. Ahmad, who was slowly healing from his trauma. Ferris, who'd taught her improvisation techniques that might save lives. Lieutenant Hakim, who carried the weight of command with quiet dignity. These weren't just allies of convenience, they were people she cared about, and she would not let them die if she could prevent it. The sun set over Checkpoint Charlie like a red wound in the sky, and Elena knew that tomorrow would test everything she believed about herself, her squad, and the nature of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But she also knew that when the test came, her soft heart would not fail her. It would be her greatest strength. The attack began at dawn with the whistle of incoming mortar. Elena's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness as the first explosion shook dust from the bunker ceiling. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in Chicago, responding to a car crash. But the rapid succession of explosions and the sharp crack of rifle fire quickly brought her back to brutal reality. Incoming! Morrison's voice cut through the chaos as Alpha Squad scrambled to their positions. Elena grabbed her medical bag and helmet, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This was it, the moment she'd trained for, dreaded, and somehow known was inevitable. The checkpoint's defensive positions erupted with return fire as local soldiers engaged targets Elena couldn't yet see. Through the bunker's narrow window, she caught glimpses of muzzle flashes winking from the surrounding hills like deadly fireflies. The insurgents had chosen their moment well-dawn light that silhouetted the defenders while leaving the attackers in shadow. "Martinez," Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got wounded at position 3. Move." Elena's world narrowed to essentials: medical bag, body armor, helmet. The 20-meter sprint from her bunker to position 3, where Tank had set up his heavy machine gun. The journey seemed to take forever and no time at all, each footstep accompanied by the crack of bullets passing overhead and the deeper thump of Tank's M240. Returning fire, she found Tank pressed against his position sandbags, his left shoulder. Bloody but his weapon still firing controlled bursts at insurgent positions. Beside him, Private Kowalski clutched his leg, his face pale with shock and pain. "Shrapnel from the first mortar barrage," Tank shouted over the gunfire. "Got both of U.S., but Razor took the worst of it." Elena's training took over, suppressing fear and focusing on the immediate medical needs. Razor's wound was serious. A jagged piece of metal had torn through his thigh, missing the femoral artery by inches, but causing significant muscle damage and blood loss. Elena applied pressure to control the bleeding while assessing Tank's shoulder wound. "You'll live," she told Tank, whose injury was painful but not life-threatening. "Keep that gun running. Razor, I need you to stay with me and stay conscious. You're going to be fine." As she worked to stabilize Razor's leg, Elena became aware of another voice calling for medical assistance, this time in Arabic. Ahmad, the young local soldier she'd been working with, was shouting from a position 30 meters away. One of his comrades had been hit. "I have to go," Elena told Tank, who was already back behind his weapon. "Negative." Morrison's voice cut through her headset. "Martinez, you stay with our people." Elena looked across the compound to where Ahmad was frantically waving for help. She could see blood on his hands, could hear the pain in his voice as he called for assistance. The wounded soldier was one she recognized, a quiet man named Halil, who'd shown her pictures of his young children during one of their conversations. The dilemma Morrison had predicted was playing out in real time: save her own people or help the allies who were fighting and dying for the same cause. But as Elena looked at the situation tactically, she realized it wasn't really a choice at all. "Tank can fight," she radioed back to Morrison. "Razor's stable. The local position is about to be overrun if they lose another man. I'm going." Before Morrison could respond, Elena was moving, keeping low as she sprinted across open ground under fire. Bullets whined overhead, and she could hear Morrison cursing over the radio. But she reached Ahmad's position without being hit. Halil had taken a round through the chest, and his breathing was labored. Elena recognized the signs of a tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung that would kill him in minutes if not treated immediately. She had the equipment to save him, but the procedure required several minutes of focused work under combat conditions. "Cover me," she told Ahmad, who immediately positioned himself to provide protective fire while Elena worked. Her hands moved with practiced precision, decompressing Halil's chest and restoring his ability to breathe. The wounded soldier's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with desperate gratitude. "American angel," he whispered in English, but Elena's success came at a cost. While she'd been focused on medical treatment, the insurgent assault had intensified. Through her headset, she could hear the sharp exchanges of the ongoing firefight, the calls for ammunition, the growing desperation in Morrison's voice as he tried to coordinate the defense. "Martinez, we need you back here now." Chun's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Santos is hit bad." Elena's heart lurched. Santos Rick, the kid from Los Angeles who'd been one of her harshest critics, but who'd slowly been warming to her presence. She looked down at Halil, who was breathing easier but still needed careful monitoring. Then at Ahmad, whose eyes reflected his understanding of her dilemma. "Go," Ahmad said firmly. "I will care for him. You taught me how." Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. She'd trained Ahmad well, and Halil was stable enough to survive with basic care. Santos might not have that luxury. The sprint back to Alpha Squad's positions took her through the heaviest fire yet. Insurgent forces had advanced closer to the checkpoint's perimeter, and Elena could see muzzle flashes from positions that had been empty minutes earlier. A bullet tugged at her sleeve, another sparked off the ground inches from her feet. But somehow she reached Santos's position unharmed. She found Rick Santos curled behind inadequate cover, clutching his abdomen while blood seeped between his fingers. Doc was beside him, applying pressure to the wound while trying to maintain radio communications with base command. "Entry wound low on the left side," Doc reported quickly. "No exit wound visible. He's conscious but losing blood fast." Elena's assessment confirmed Doc's initial diagnosis. Santos had taken a rifle round to the abdomen, possibly causing internal bleeding that could prove fatal if not treated quickly. She needed to stabilize him for evacuation, but the medevac helicopter couldn't land under current fire conditions. "We need to suppress those positions," Elena radioed to Morrison. "I can save him, but I need time and cover." Morrison's response was immediate. "Crow Tank, lay down suppressive fire on the ridgeline. Chun, coordinate with Lieutenant Hakim. I want every gun we have putting fire on those positions." The volume of defensive fire increased dramatically as American and local forces coordinated their response. Elena used the covering fire to work on Santos, establishing an IV line and administering morphine for pain management. The young soldier's vital signs were concerning but stable. He would survive if they could get him to proper surgical facilities. "How bad is it, Doc?" Santos asked through gritted teeth, using Elena's nickname rather than her rank for the first time. "Bad enough that you're going home to Los Angeles," Elena replied with forced lightness. "Good enough that you'll live to complain about the food there." Santos managed a weak smile. "Soft heart saves hard cases, huh?" Before Elena could respond, another call for medical assistance came over the radio, this time from Crow's position. The sniper had been providing crucial long-range fire support, but an insurgent mortar had gotten close enough to wound him. Elena looked at Santos, who was stable but still needed monitoring, then at Doc, who was managing communications while keeping pressure on the chest wound of another local soldier who'd been brought to their position. "I have to go," she told Doc. "Elena," Doc said seriously, using her first name, "you can't save everyone. At some point, you're going to have to make choices." "I'm not there yet," Elena replied. grabbing fresh supplies from her bag. Crow's position was the most exposed in the checkpoint's defense, an elevated fighting position that provided excellent fields of fire, but minimal protection from incoming rounds. Elena found James Blackwood still at his rifle, methodically engaging targets despite blood running down his face from shrapnel wounds. "How bad?" she asked, quickly assessing his injuries. The wounds looked worse than they were head injuries. Always bled heavily, but Crow had maintained his focus and effectiveness despite being wounded. "I can still shoot," Crow said simply, which Elena had learned was his way of saying he wasn't going to leave his position voluntarily. Elena cleaned and bandaged his wounds while Crow continued to engage targets. His marksmanship was keeping insurgent forces from advancing on the checkpoint's most vulnerable flank, making him invaluable to the defense despite his injuries. "You need to fall back to a covered position," Elena told him. "Negative," Crow replied, without taking his eye from his scope. "They advance down that draw. We're all dead. I stay." Elena understood his logic, even as she worried about his safety. In combat, individual survival sometimes had to be subordinated to mission success. Crow's position was critical to the defense, and his wounds, while painful, weren't immediately life-threatening. "At least let me improve your cover," Elena said, beginning to reinforce his position with additional sandbags. While he continued to fire as she worked, Elena became aware of a shift in the battle's tempo. The insurgent assault was losing momentum, their advance stalled by the checkpoint's determined resistance. But the cost had been significant. She could see wounded soldiers at multiple positions, both American and local forces who needed immediate medical attention. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "All positions. Insurgent forces are falling back. Maintain defensive posture, but prepare for casualty evacuation." Elena felt a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. The immediate threat might be receding, but the medical crisis was just beginning. She had multiple wounded soldiers scattered across the checkpoint, each requiring different levels of care, and limited resources to treat them all. "Doc," she radioed, "I need a casualty report. How many wounded do we have?" 3 Americans, at least 6 locals," Doc responded. "Santos is priority 1 for evacuation. Tank and Crow are walking wounded. The locals ... I'm not sure about all of them." Elena made a quick decision. "I'm going to do a complete casualty assessment. Keep monitoring Santos's vitals are the most critical." What followed was Elena's introduction to the brutal arithmetic of battlefield medicine. Moving from position to position, she triaged wounded soldiers according to the severity of their injuries and the likelihood of survival with available treatment. Some decisions were easy. Tank's shoulder wound was painful but not life-threatening, while Santos clearly needed immediate evacuation. Others were harder. She found Faris, the local medic, treating the soldier who'd taken shrapnel to the chest and abdomen. The man was conscious but losing blood rapidly, and Faris's supplies were inadequate for the severity of his injuries. "I need morphine," Faris said desperately. "And blood. He has lost too much blood." Elena assessed the soldier quickly. The wounds were severe, requiring surgery that wasn't available at the checkpoint. Even with optimal treatment, his chances of survival were poor. But Faris was asking for morphine to manage his pain, not to save his life. "What's his name?" Elena asked. "Yusuf," Faris replied. "He has 3 daughters. His wife is pregnant with their 4th child." Elena looked into Yusuf's eyes and saw awareness there. He knew he was dying, but he was fighting to stay conscious, to say something to the medic who'd been his friend. She administered morphine to ease his pain and sat with him while Faris spoke to him, Arabic, their voices soft and urgent. "He wants his family to know he died fighting," Faris translated. "He wants them to be proud." "They will be," Lena said. Simply, and she meant it. Yusuf died quietly 10 minutes later, his hand clasped in Faris's. Elena felt the familiar ache of loss, but there was no time to grieve. Other wounded soldiers needed her attention, and a medevac helicopter was finally approaching now that the immediate threat had passed. The evacuation of Santos went smoothly. The helicopter touched down just long enough to load him and 2 critically wounded local soldiers before lifting off again. Elena watched it disappear into the morning sky, carrying away soldiers who might survive because of the medical care they'd received. But the battle's aftermath brought new challenges. The checkpoint had held, but barely. 3 local soldiers were dead, with 6 more wounded badly enough to require evacuation or extended medical care. Alpha Squad had suffered casualties but remained combat effective. The insurgent attack had been repelled, but intelligence suggested it was merely a probing action, testing the checkpoint's defenses for a larger assault to come. Martinez, Morrison called as Elena finished treating the last of the wounded. "We need to talk." She found the squad leader in Lieutenant Hakim's command bunker, studying maps and casualty reports. His expression was unreadable, but Elena could sense tension in his posture. "Santos is going to make it," Morrison said without preamble. "The corpsman at the base says your field treatment probably saved his life." Elena felt a wave of relief. "That's good news." "It is," Morrison agreed. "But we need to discuss what happened out there. You disobeyed direct orders when you left our position to treat the local soldier." Elena had expected this conversation, but she'd hoped Morrison might understand her reasoning given the successful outcome. "Halil was dying. I had the skills to save him. Ahmad couldn't have done it alone." "That's not the point," Morrison said firmly. "In combat, unit cohesion and command authority are what keep us alive. When you decide to freelance, you put everyone at risk." "I put 1 soldier at risk to save another," Elena countered, "and both survived because of that decision." Morrison studied her carefully. "What if Santos had died while you were treating Halil? How would you live with that choice?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the successful outcome that she hadn't fully considered the terrible alternatives. If Santos had taken a turn for the worse while she was away, if his wounds had proved more severe than initially assessed, her decision to help Halil might have cost an American soldier his life. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "But I knew Santos was stable when I left. I trained Ahmad to handle Halil's follow-up care. I made calculated decisions based on medical priorities." "Medical priorities," Morrison repeated. "That's the problem, Martinez. Out here, medical priorities and military priorities don't always align. You're part of Alpha Squad first, a medic second. I need to know that you understand that." Elena felt a flash of anger. "I became a medic because I wanted to save lives, Sergeant. All lives. I didn't sign up to play favorites based on nationality." "Then maybe you signed up for the wrong job," Morrison said bluntly. "Because in combat, we do play favorites. We take care of our own first, our allies second, and everyone else third. That's not cruelty, it's survival." The argument was interrupted by Lieutenant Hakim, who had been listening quietly from his position at the radio. "Sergeant Morrison," he said in careful English, "your medic saved the life of one of my best soldiers today. Halil has 2 young children. Because of her courage, they will not be orphans." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I understand that, Lieutenant, and I'm glad your man survived. But I have to think about the overall mission and the safety of my squad." "As do I," Hakim replied. "And I think your medic understands something that many soldiers do not, that we are stronger when we fight together than when we fight alone." Today, her actions built trust between our forces. That trust may save many lives in the battles too. "Come." Elena felt grateful for Hakim's support, but she could see that Morrison remained unconvinced. The squad leader's concerns were legitimate from a military standpoint. Unit cohesion and clear command authority were essential for combat effectiveness. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that his perspective was too narrow, that he was missing something crucial about the nature of their mission. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "I understand your concerns about command authority, but I think there's a bigger picture here. We're not just fighting to kill insurgents, we're fighting to build a stable society. Every local soldier who trusts us, every family that sees us as protectors rather than occupiers, makes our mission more likely to succeed." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through her argument. "Maybe," he said finally, "but that's a strategic consideration for officers above my pay grade. My job is to keep Alpha Squad alive and combat effective. Your job is to keep us healthy enough to do our jobs. What if those two things are the same job?" Elena asked. Before Morrison could respond, Doc's voice crackled over the radio with an urgent update. "Base command to Alpha Squad. Intelligence reports large-scale insurgent movement throughout Sector 7. Multiple checkpoints are under attack. We're being hit as part of a coordinated offensive." The strategic situation had just become much more complicated. What they'd experienced wasn't an isolated attack on their position. It was part of a larger insurgent operation designed to drive coalition forces out of the region entirely. The next few days would test not just Alpha Squad's military capabilities, but the relationships Elena had been building with local forces. "Looks like we're about to find out whose approach works better," Morrison said grimly. The second attack came 18 hours later, just after midnight. This time, the insurgents approached with more sophistication, using coordinated small unit tactics to probe the checkpoint's defenses while maintaining pressure from multiple directions. Elena found herself moving constantly between wounded soldiers, treating injuries that ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to life-threatening trauma. The difference this time was immediately apparent. The cooperation between American and local forces had improved dramatically. Ahmad and several other local soldiers had learned basic first aid from Elena, allowing them to provide initial treatment for wounded comrades while she focused on the most serious cases. Ferris worked beside her with increased confidence, his skills enhanced by the equipment and training she'd provided. "We're more effective as a team," Elena observed to Doc during a brief lull in the fighting. "Morrison's noticed too," Doc replied. "He hasn't said anything, but I can see him watching how the locals respond to you. They trust you in a way they don't trust the rest of us." That trust proved crucial when Crow's position came under direct assault from a squad of insurgents who'd infiltrated to within 30 meters of the checkpoint's perimeter. The sniper was pinned down by automatic weapons fire, unable to retreat from his elevated position without exposing himself to fatal gunfire. "I can't get to him," Tank reported over the radio. "Too much fire between here and there." Elena assessed the situation quickly. Crow's position was isolated, but not completely cut off. There was a covered approach that local forces used for resupply runs, but reaching it required moving through an area that the local soldiers knew intimately, but that would be unfamiliar and dangerous for American forces. "Ahmad," she called to the young soldier who'd become her informal assistant, "can you get me to Crow's position?" Ahmad studied the tactical situation, his expression serious. "Yes, but it is very dangerous. The insurgents have machine gun position. That covers most approaches, but not all of them." "There is one path," Ahmad admitted. "Very narrow, very dangerous, but possible." Morrison had been monitoring their conversation. "Negative, Martinez. We're not risking two people to save one." "Crow's position is critical to our defense," Elena argued. "If we lose him, the insurgents can advance down that entire flank. Then we'll find another way to support him." But Elena was already moving, following Ahmad as he led her along a route that took them through a drainage ditch, past abandoned supply bunkers, and finally to a position where they could reach Crow without exposing themselves to the insurgent machine gun. The journey took 15 minutes of careful movement, with Ahmed constantly checking for enemy positions while Elena carried medical supplies and additional ammunition for Crow's rifle. When they finally reached the sniper's position, Elena found him still fighting effectively despite a painful leg wound that was affecting his mobility. "You shouldn't have come," Crow said simply, but Elena could hear relief in his voice. "Ahmad knew a way," Elena replied, quickly assessing and treating his leg wound. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't bleed out up here." While Elena worked on his injury, Ahmad positioned himself to provide additional security for their position. The young local soldier moved with growing confidence, his tactical awareness sharpened by weeks of working alongside American forces. "He's good," Crow observed, watching Ahmad's professional positioning. "Better than half the American soldiers I've worked with." Elena felt a surge of pride in Ahmad's development, but her satisfaction was interrupted by urgent radio traffic. From the checkpoint's main defensive positions, the insurgent assault was intensifying, with multiple squads attempting to breach the perimeter simultaneously. "We need to get back," Elena told Ahmad. "The others need medical support." The return journey proved more dangerous than their approach. Insurgent forces had repositioned during their absence, closing off some of the routes Ahmad had used earlier. They were forced to take a longer path that exposed them to observation and potential fire from enemy positions. Halfway back to the main defensive line, they encountered two wounded local soldiers who'd been separated from their unit during the fighting. Both men were conscious but unable to walk due to leg wounds, and they were hiding in a damaged building while insurgent patrols searched the area around them. "We have to help them," Ahmad said immediately. Elena assessed the situation quickly. The wounded soldiers were in immediate danger of capture or execution if insurgent forces found them, but extracting them would require exposing her team to significant risk. She could radio for support, but American and local forces were already fully engaged defending the checkpoint. "Can you get them back to our lines?" she asked Ahmad. "Not alone," he admitted. "They cannot walk, and the insurgents are too close." Elena made a decision that she knew Morrison would disapprove of, but that felt absolutely right from a medical and tactical standpoint. "Then we do it together." The extraction took another hour of careful movement, with Elena and Ahmad taking turns carrying the wounded soldiers through a maze of abandoned buildings and damaged infrastructure. Several times they had to hide while insurgent patrols passed nearby, listening to foreign voices discussing search patterns and tactical objectives. When they finally reached the checkpoint's defensive perimeter, Elena was exhausted but triumphant. They'd successfully extracted Crow from his isolated position, evacuated two wounded soldiers from behind enemy lines, and gathered valuable intelligence about insurgent tactics and positioning. Morrison was waiting for them at the aid station, his expression unreadable. "Martinez, we need to talk, again." "After I treat these wounded," Elena replied firmly. "Now," Morrison insisted. "Doc can handle the medical treatment." Elena reluctantly followed Morrison to a quiet corner of the command bunker, leaving Ahmad to help Doc with the wounded soldiers they'd rescued. She could sense the squad leader's frustration and prepared herself for another lecture about following orders and maintaining unit discipline. "You deliberately disobeyed another direct order," Morrison began. "I saved lives and gathered intelligence," Elena countered. "Both American and local forces. You risked your life and the life of a local soldier on an unauthorized mission that could have compromised our defensive posture," Morrison shot back. "What if you'd been captured? What if Ahmed had been killed? How does that serve our mission?" Elena felt her temper rising. "Our mission is supposed to be building stability and security in this region. How does abandoning wounded allies serve that goal?" "Our mission," Morrison said firmly, "is to keep Alpha Squad alive and combat effective while supporting local forces to the extent possible. You keep expanding that definition to include personal rescue missions." "Personal rescue missions?" Elena's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. Those soldiers were wounded fighting the same enemy we're fighting, for the same cause we're supporting. There's nothing personal about medical assistance. Morrison studied her carefully, isn't there? You've gotten emotionally involved with these people, Martinez. You're not thinking like a soldier anymore. You're thinking like a civilian paramedic who can't stand to see anyone suffer. The accusation stung because Elena suspected there was some truth to it. She had formed personal connections with the local soldiers, particularly Ahmad and Faris. Their courage and dedication had earned her respect and affection, making their safety feel like a personal responsibility rather than just a military objective. Maybe thinking like a medic instead of just a soldier is exactly what this situation needs, she said quietly. Before Morrison could respond, Lieutenant Hakim approached with an expression of urgent concern. Sergeant Morrison, Specialist Martinez, we have received radio communication from the other checkpoints in our sector. The insurgent offensive has been more successful than we realized. Hakim spread a map on the command table, marking positions with red ink that indicated fallen or compromised checkpoints. Positions Alpha and Bravo have been overrun. Position Delta is under siege and requesting immediate reinforcement. We are now the only remaining stronghold in the entire sector. The strategic implications were staggering. Alpha Squad and the local garrison at Checkpoint Charlie weren't just holding a remote outpost anymore. They were the last line of defense preventing insurgent forces from controlling a crucial corridor that could be used to disrupt coalition operations throughout the region. What about reinforcements? Morrison asked. Unavailable, Hakim replied grimly. All available forces are engaged in defensive operations. Coalition Command estimates it will be 48 hours before reinforcements can reach our position. Morrison absorbed this information with professional calm, but Elena could see the concern in his eyes. Alpha Squad was now facing the prospect of defending an isolated position against overwhelming enemy forces for at least 2 more days, with no prospect of evacuation or significant reinforcement. Our ammunition situation? Morrison asked. Adequate for another major engagement, Chun reported. But if they hit us with the same intensity as the other checkpoints, we'll be running low by tomorrow night. Elena found herself thinking about the wounded soldiers they'd rescued earlier, about Enmaid's growing skills as a combat medic, about the trust that local forces had placed in American leadership. The relationships she'd been building weren't just personal connections. They were becoming crucial tactical assets as the military situation deteriorated. Sergeant, she said carefully, I think our best chance of survival is to maximize cooperation between American and local forces. The more effectively we work together, the more combat power we can generate with limited resources. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing? Cross-training, Elena replied. I train more local soldiers in advanced first aid, so we have more medics available during combat. Ahmad and the others train our people in local terrain knowledge and infiltration routes. We share intelligence and tactical responsibilities completely. That's a significant departure from standard operating procedures, Morrison said slowly. Standard operating procedures haven't kept the other checkpoints from being overrun, Elena pointed out. Maybe we need to try something different. Hakim had been listening to their discussion with obvious interest. Your medic is correct, Sergeant Morrison. My soldiers trust her in ways they do not trust other Americans. That trust could be very valuable in the difficult days ahead. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of Elena's proposal. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. All right, Martinez. We'll try it your way. But if this approach gets people killed, the responsibility is yours. Elena felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy pack. Morrison wasn't just giving her permission to continue building relationships with local forces. He was making her accountable for the success or failure of their integrated defense strategy. "I understand," she said simply. The next 12 hours proved to be an intensive period of preparation and cross-training. Elena worked with Ahmad and Faris to establish a more sophisticated medical response system, teaching advanced trauma treatment to soldiers who'd never seen anything more complex than basic first aid. Ahmad, in turn, shared his knowledge of local terrain with American forces, showing them infiltration routes, observation positions, and defensive advantages that weren't apparent to outsiders. More importantly, the forced cooperation began breaking down cultural and linguistic barriers that had been limiting tactical effectiveness. American soldiers learned Arabic phrases for medical and tactical communication, while local forces became more comfortable working with unfamiliar American equipment and procedures. "It's working," Doc observed as they prepared for what intelligence suggested would be the largest insurgent assault yet. "The locals are fighting like they're part of Alpha Squad, and our people are starting to think of them as squad mates rather than just allies." Elena felt a surge of hope, but she knew the real test was still ahead. When the next attack came, they would discover whether her soft heart approach could generate enough combat effectiveness to keep them all alive, or whether Morrison's concerns about operational security and unit discipline would prove prophetic. Insurgent forces were massing in the hills around Checkpoint Charlie, and Elena could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Soon, very soon, everything she believed about the power of human connection in combat would be put to the ultimate test. We're deep into this incredible story now, and I hope you're as captivated as I am by these unfolding events. The amount of effort that goes into researching, writing, and narrating these novel-length stories is immense. We're talking about creating content equivalent to a published book. But it's worth it to bring you stories that truly engage and transport you to another world. If you're enjoying this journey so far, please take a second to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate great storytelling. Your support means everything and helps us continue creating these detailed, epic narratives. We still have so much more to discover together. So let's see how this situation unfolds. The third major assault began at sunset, and from the first moments, Elena could tell it was different from the previous attacks. The insurgents approached with disciplined fire and movement, using coordinated tactics that suggested extensive planning and professional military training. This wasn't a probe or a raid, it was a deliberate attempt to destroy the checkpoint and eliminate everyone defending it. Multiple squads approaching from the north and east, Crow reported from his rebuilt position. At least 40 fighters. Possibly more. They're using suppressive fire and squad rushes. Someone's been training them. Elena felt her stomach tighten with familiar pre-combat anxiety, but underneath the fear was something new, a calm confidence born from the relationship she'd built and the integrated defense system they'd established. Ahmad was positioned at her aid station, ready to assist with medical treatment or provide security as needed. Faris had set up a secondary medical position to ensure wounded soldiers could receive immediate care regardless of where casualties occurred. "All positions, this is Morrison." The squad leader's voice cut through the radio traffic. "This is the big one. Fight smart, conserve ammunition, and watch your sectors. Martinez, I want casualty reports immediately when anyone goes down." The battle began with a coordinated mortar barrage that was more accurate and sustained than anything the checkpoint had faced before. Elena found herself pressed against her bunker's reinforced walls as explosions walked across the defensive perimeter, each detonation shaking dust from the ceiling and sending shrapnel singing through the air. When the mortar fire lifted, insurgent assault squads advanced from multiple directions simultaneously. Elena could hear the distinct crack of AK-47 rifles, mixing with the deeper thump of RPG explosions and the sustained fire of machine guns. Through her bunker's narrow window, She caught glimpses of muzzle flashes moving closer to the perimeter wire. "Martinez, I've got wounded at position 2. Chun's voice cut through the chaos. "Multiple casualties. Need immediate assistance." Elena grabbed her medical bag and prepared to move, but Ahmed caught her arm. "Too dangerous," he said urgently. "Machine gun fire covers that approach. We find another way." Ahmad's tactical awareness had improved dramatically over the past weeks, and Elena trusted his judgment completely. Together, they plotted a covered route to position 2 that took them through a series of connecting trenches and reinforced bunkers. They found Chun's position under heavy fire, with 2 local soldiers and Tank all requiring immediate medical attention. Tank had taken shrapnel to his leg and arm, but was still operating his heavy machine gun, laying down suppressive fire that was crucial to preventing insurgent forces from advancing across open ground. "How bad?" Elena asked, quickly assessing the wounds while staying low to avoid sniper fire. "I'll live," Tank grunted, never taking his eyes off his weapon sights. "But these guys need help fast." The 2 local soldiers had been caught in an RPG explosion that had partially collapsed their fighting position. One had a penetrating chest wound that required immediate treatment, while the other was unconscious with what appeared to be a severe concussion and possible skull fracture. Elena went to work with practiced efficiency, establishing 4 lines and administering morphine, while Ahmad provided security and assisted with medical procedures he'd learned during their training sessions. The chest wound was serious but treatable with the equipment she carried. The head injury was more concerning because it required diagnostic capabilities that weren't available at the checkpoint. "We need to evacuate Hamid," she told Ahmad, indicating the unconscious soldier. "Head injuries can deteriorate rapidly, and I don't have the equipment to monitor his condition properly." "No evacuation possible," Morrison's voice cut through her headset. "Helicopter support is unavailable, too much ground fire. We treat everyone on site until the situation stabilizes." Elena felt a familiar frustration with the limitations of battlefield medicine, but she pushed it aside to focus on what was possible rather than what wasn't. She stabilized both wounded soldiers as best she could, then left Ahmed to monitor their condition while she responded to calls for medical assistance from other positions. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of movement, medical treatment, and constant adaptation to changing tactical circumstances. Elena found herself moving throughout the checkpoint's defensive positions, treating wounds that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. Each medical emergency required not just clinical skills, but tactical awareness, choosing routes that avoided enemy fire, timing movements to coincide with friendly suppressive fire, working under conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian emergency medicine. But the integrated defense system she'd helped create was proving its worth. Local soldiers trained in first aid were providing initial treatment for wounded comrades, allowing Elena to focus on the most serious cases. American forces were using terrain knowledge shared by local allies to establish better defensive positions and more effective fields of fire. Most importantly, the mutual trust between the 2 groups had eliminated the hesitation and miscommunication that had plagued earlier engagements. "Your approach is working," Doc observed during a brief lull in the fighting. "Casualties are down compared to the first attack, despite this being a much heavier assault." Elena felt a surge of professional pride, but it was tempered by awareness of how much work remained. The insurgent forces showed no signs of breaking off their attack, and ammunition supplies were becoming a serious concern. More troubling, the enemy seemed to be learning from their failures, adapting their tactics in response to the checkpoint's defenses. "They're probing for weak points," Crow reported during his hourly tactical update. "Small teams trying to infiltrate from different directions, testing our response times and fire coverage." Morrison's response was immediate. "All positions maintain alert status. They're looking for an opening, don't give them one." But Elena could hear the strain in Morrison's voice, could see the exhaustion in the faces of soldiers who'd been fighting for hours without rest. The checkpoint was holding, but barely, and everyone involved understood that their defensive success was buying time rather than achieving decisive victory. The breakthrough moment came just after midnight, when Ahmad spotted a small insurgent team attempting to infiltrate through a drainage system that had been damaged during the initial mortar bombardment. His knowledge of the checkpoint's infrastructure allowed him to predict where the infiltrators would emerge, giving defenders crucial seconds to prepare an ambush. "Contact, southeast drainage outlet," Ahmad radioed calmly, his English pronunciation improved by weeks of practice. 4 fighters moving toward ammunition bunker. Elena watched from her aid station as American and local forces coordinated a response that eliminated the infiltration threat before it could compromise the checkpoint's defenses. The operation was executed with professional precision, but more importantly, it demonstrated the tactical advantages of Elena's integrated approach. "Nice work," Morrison radioed to Ahmad, and Elena could hear genuine respect in the squad leader's voice. As dawn approached, the insurgent assault gradually lost intensity. Enemy forces began withdrawing to positions beyond effective rifle range, though they maintained enough pressure to prevent any relaxation of defensive vigilance. Elena used the reduced combat tempo to conduct a comprehensive assessment of casualties and medical supplies. The results were sobering but manageable. Alpha Squad had suffered no killed in action, though Tank and Crow both required follow-up medical treatment for their wounds. Local forces had lost 2 soldiers killed and 6 wounded, but the casualty rate was significantly lower than what other checkpoints had experienced during similar attacks. "Medical supplies are adequate for one more major engagement," Elena reported to Morrison. "But we're running low on morphine and 4 fluids. If this continues much longer, pain management is going to become a serious problem." Morrison nodded grimly. "Ammunition's in similar shape. We can hold against another assault like last night's, but it'll have to be our last stand." The stark mathematics of their situation were becoming clear. Without resupply or reinforcement, Checkpoint Charlie could survive one more major battle. After that, they would lack the resources to mount an effective defense against determined insurgent forces. "What about evacuation?" Shun asked. "Still not an option," Morrison replied. "Command says helicopter operations are too risky given enemy air defense capabilities. We're on our own until the tactical situation improves." Elena found herself thinking about the soldier she'd come to know over the past weeks, Ahmad, whose courage and skill had saved lives during the night's fighting. Ferris, whose medical knowledge had proven invaluable under combat conditions. Lieutenant Hakim, whose leadership had kept local forces effective despite devastating losses. The thought of these men being overrun and killed because of inadequate support felt like a personal failure. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "what if we don't wait for the situation to improve? What if we take action to improve it ourselves?" Morrison looked at her suspiciously. "What exactly are you suggesting, Martinez?" Elena had been thinking about this possibility throughout the night's fighting, weighing the risks against potential benefits. A breakout operation. Instead of waiting for the insurgents to mass for another assault, we hit them first. Disrupt their planning, scatter their forces, maybe even capture some intelligence about their overall strategy. "That's a hell of a risk," Morrison said slowly. "If we leave the checkpoint and get caught in the open, we're all dead. If we stay here and fight another defensive battle with limited ammunition and medical supplies, we're probably dead anyway." Elena countered. "At least this way, we'd be taking initiative instead of just reacting." Chun had been listening to their discussion with obvious interest. "It's not completely crazy," she said thoughtfully. "The enemy expects us to stay defensive. A limited offensive operation might catch them off guard." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing their options. Elena could see him calculating ammunition expenditures, casualty probabilities, and mission requirements with the analytical mind of a professional soldier. "It would have to be a joint operation," he said finally. "American and local forces working together completely. No separate command structures, no communication barriers, no operational security concerns." Elena felt her heart rate increase. Morrison wasn't just considering her proposal, he was accepting the integrated approach she'd been advocating since her arrival at the checkpoint. "Ahmad and his people know this terrain better than we ever will," she said. "They can guide us to positions where we'd have tactical advantages, and they're motivated to succeed because this is their home." "All right," Morrison decided, "we'll try it. But this is your operation, Martinez. If it fails, if people die because of bad planning or execution, that's on you." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders again, but this time it felt different, not like a burden imposed by authority, but like a trust earned through demonstrated competence and commitment. "I understand," she said simply. The next 12 hours were spent in intensive planning and preparation. Elena worked with Ahmad Faris and Lieutenant Hakim to develop a tactical plan that maximized their advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. American forces contributed heavy weapons and advanced communications equipment, while local forces provided terrain knowledge and intelligence about insurgent positions. The resulting operation was unlike anything Elena had trained for. A complex coordination of multiple small units attacking predetermined targets simultaneously, designed to create maximum confusion and disruption among enemy forces. Success would depend not just on military skills, but on the trust and communication between soldiers who'd learned to see each other as partners rather than just allies. "This is either brilliant or suicidal," Doc observed as they made final preparations. "Probably both." Elena checked her medical supplies one more time, knowing that casualties during the operation would have to be treated under field conditions with limited resources. But she felt confident in the planning, confident in the relationship she'd built, and confident that the integrated approach she'd championed would prove its worth under the ultimate test of combat. "Ready?" Morrison asked, his question directed not just at Elena, but at the entire mixed group of American and local forces who would participate in the operation. Elena looked around at the faces of soldiers who'd become more than allies. They'd become a team united by shared danger and mutual respect. Ahmad nodded confidently, his medical training and tactical skills making him invaluable in multiple roles. Faris checked his equipment with the careful precision of a professional. Even Tank and Crow, despite their wounds, insisted on participating in the operation. "Ready," Elena replied, and meant it completely. The breakout operation would test everything she'd learned about leadership, medicine, and human nature under the ultimate stress of combat. But as Alpha Squad and their local allies moved out into the pre-dawn darkness, Elena felt a certainty that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The attack commenced at 0400 hours, with Alpha Squad and local forces moving through darkness toward predetermined targets. Elena found herself attached to a mixed team led by Ahmad, whose intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed them to approach insurgent positions without detection. The operation's success depended on achieving complete surprise if enemy forces had time to coordinate a response. The small attacking units would be overwhelmed and destroyed. Elena's role was complex. She served as the team's medic, but also as the primary communications link with Morrison's command element, and as an advisor on tactical decisions that affected casualties. The multiple responsibilities required constant mental adjustment as situations changed rapidly and unpredictably. "First objective in sight," Ahmad whispered into his radio, his English now confident enough for complex tactical communication. 2 sentries visible, probable fighting position behind them. Elena studied the target through her night vision scopa, improvised bunker that insurgent forces had been using to direct mortar fire against the checkpoint. Intelligence suggested that eliminating this position would significantly reduce enemy capability to coordinate indirect fire support. The assault was executed with professional precision. Local soldiers who trained extensively with Alpha Squad moved with the discipline and coordination of regular forces, while American weapons and communications provided capabilities that local forces had previously lacked. The fighting position was overrun in less than 3 minutes, with no friendly casualties and valuable intelligence captured about enemy plans and capabilities. Objective secured, Elena radioed to Morrison. Multiple documents recovered, no friendly casualties. Outstanding, Morrison replied, and Elena could hear genuine satisfaction in his voice. Continue to Phase 2. Phase 2 involved a more complex operation, simultaneous attacks on 3 separate insurgent positions, designed to prevent enemy forces from concentrating their defensive efforts. Elena's team was assigned the most difficult target, a suspected command post located in a cluster of abandoned buildings that offered excellent defensive advantages. As they approached the target area, Elena found herself thinking about the evolution of her relationships with the soldiers around her. Ahmad had become more than an assistant. He was now a trusted partner whose judgment she valued completely. Faris had developed into a skilled combat medic whose techniques sometimes surpassed her own. Even the local soldiers she'd initially known only by name had become individuals whose safety felt like a personal responsibility. Movement ahead, Ahmad reported quietly. Multiple positions, probably company-sized element. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Intelligence had suggested they'd be facing squad-sized resistance, but the situation was clearly more complex than anticipated. A company-sized enemy force would have significant advantages in defensive combat, particularly fighting from prepared positions, with overlapping fields of fire. "We abort," Elena whispered into her radio, making the tactical decision that Morrison had authorized her to make. "Too much resistance for our force size." But Ahmad caught her arm before she could order the withdrawal. "Wait," he said quietly. "These buildings, I know them. There's another way." Elena looked at him questioningly, aware that every second of delay increased their risk of detection. "My cousin lived here before the war," Ahmad explained rapidly. "Connected basements, tunnel system for water pipes. We can approach from underground, avoid their defensive positions." It was the kind of local knowledge that no amount of satellite imagery or intelligence briefings could provide. Intimate familiarity with infrastructure that had been part of daily life before becoming a battlefield. Elena realized that this was exactly why the integrated approach was so valuable. Local soldiers brought capabilities that American forces simply couldn't replicate. "Show us," she decided. The next 20 minutes were among the most dangerous of Elena's military career. Following Ahmad through a maze of damaged basements and collapsed tunnels, she had to trust completely in his knowledge while maintaining readiness to treat casualties in conditions that would make normal medical procedures nearly impossible. Tunnel system brought them directly underneath the suspected command post, allowing them to hear enemy voices and radio communications without being detected. More importantly, it positioned them to attack from a direction that insurgent forces had left completely undefended. "Multiple radio sets," Elena whispered, identifying the tactical significance of what they were hearing. "This is definitely a command element." The assault from below achieved complete surprise. Elena's team emerged into the enemy position before insurgent forces realized they were under attack, capturing valuable equipment and personnel while eliminating a crucial node in the enemy's command structure, but success came at a cost. During the brief firefight, one of the local soldiers with Elena's team took a bullet through the shoulder, and Ahmad suffered a concussion when an insurgent grenade detonated close to his position. Elena found herself treating wounded soldiers, while enemy forces throughout the area began responding to the attack on their command post. Radio traffic indicated that insurgent units were converging on their position from multiple directions, turning what had been a successful raid into a potential disaster. "Extract immediately," Morrison's voice cut through her headset. "Enemy forces are massing for counterattack." Elena looked at her wounded soldiers. The local soldier with the shoulder wound could move with assistance, but Ahmad's concussion was severe enough that rapid movement might cause additional brain injury. She had to make an immediate decision about medical priorities versus tactical necessities. "I need 2 minutes to stabilize Ahmad," she radioed to Morrison. "We don't have 2 minutes," Morrison replied urgently. "Enemy forces are already moving to surround your position." Elena made the kind of split-second decision that defined combat medicine. She administered a mild stimulant to Ahmad to improve his alertness temporarily, knowing that the medication might mask symptoms of serious brain injury but recognizing that evacuation was impossible if he couldn't move under his own power. "Can you walk?" she asked Ahmad directly. "I can fight," Ahmad replied, which Elena had learned was his way of saying he would do whatever the mission required, regardless of personal cost. The extraction became a running battle through the same tunnel system they'd used for approach, but now with insurgent forces fully alert and searching for them. Elena found herself providing medical treatment while moving, using techniques she'd learned in civilian emergency medicine to treat wounds under conditions of constant motion and stress. The most difficult moment came when they reached a collapsed section of tunnel that blocked their planned escape route. Enemy forces were closing in from behind. RDIO traffic indicated that surface exits were being covered by insurgent patrols, and Ahmad's condition was deteriorating despite the medication Elena had administered. "Dead end," Ahmad said matter-of-factly, his concussion making his speech slightly slurred. But his tactical awareness still sharp. Elena assessed their situation with the analytical mindset that emergency medicine had taught her. They had limited ammunition, wounded personnel, and no obvious escape route. But they also had advantages: intimate knowledge of their immediate environment, communications with friendly forces, and the kind of teamwork that came from shared danger and mutual trust. "Ahmad, is there any other way out of here?" "Maybe," he said slowly, his injured brain working through possibilities. "Old water main leads toward checkpoint. Very dangerous, could collapse." Elena weighed the risks: certain capture or death if they stayed, possible death if they attempted the water main, but also possible survival. The decision was easy from a medical standpoint. Any option that offered hope of survival was better than certain doom. "Show us," she decided. The journey through the water main was a claustrophobic nightmare that required crawling through spaces barely large enough for a human body, while carrying wounded soldiers and medical equipment. Elena found herself treating Ahmad's worsening concussion symptoms while navigating through pitch darkness, using touch and sound to monitor his condition. But the route worked. After 30 minutes of underground movement, they emerged near the checkpoint's perimeter, exhausted and filthy but alive. Ahmad's condition required immediate evacuation to proper medical facilities, but the local soldier with the shoulder wound would recover completely with basic treatment. More importantly, the intelligence they'd captured from the insurgent command post provided crucial information about enemy plans and capabilities. Documents revealed that the attacks on Checkpoint Charlie were part of a larger offensive designed to drive coalition forces from the entire region, with follow-up operations planned against supply lines and civilian targets. "This changes everything," Morrison said after reviewing the captured materials. "This isn't just about holding this checkpoint. We're dealing with a strategic threat to the entire operational area." Elena felt a surge of satisfaction at the mission's success, but it was tempered by concern for Ahmad's medical condition and awareness of the larger threat they'd uncovered. The integrated approach had proven its tactical value, but the strategic situation was becoming more dangerous rather than less. "What's our next move?" she asked. Morrison studied the intelligence reports with the focused attention of a professional. Soldier processing crucial information. We get this intelligence to higher command immediately. This is big enough that it's going to change operational planning throughout the region. But before they could act on the intelligence, the checkpoints. RADIO operator reported an incoming transmission from Coalition Command. The message was brief but alarming. Multiple checkpoints throughout the sector were reporting coordinated attacks, and intelligence suggested that checkpoint Charlie was the primary target for a major assault planned for the following night. "They're coming for us specifically," Morrison said grimly. "Everything we've done, all the resistance we've put up, it's made us a priority target." Elena felt the weight of unintended consequences. Her success in building effective cooperation between American and local forces had made their position more tactically valuable, but it had also made them a higher priority target for enemy forces. "So what do we do?" Doc asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that all involved significant risks. "We prepare for the biggest fight of our lives," he said finally. "Because if they want us that badly, they're going to bring everything they have." Elena looked around at the faces of soldiers who'd become more than just allies. They'd become a family united by shared danger and mutual respect. Ahmad was being prepared for medical evacuation, but Ferris and the other local soldiers showed no signs of abandoning their positions despite the growing threat. "We'll be ready," she said simply. And everyone present understood that readiness would be measured not just in ammunition and defensive positions, but in the relationships and trust that would allow them to fight effectively against overwhelming odds. The next 18 hours would test everything Elena believed about the power of human connection in combat. But as she prepared for what might be their final battle, she felt certain that whatever happened, they would face it together. Final assault began with an artillery barrage that dwarfed anything Checkpoint Charlie had previously endured. Elena found herself pressed against the reinforced walls of her bunker as explosions walked methodically across the defensive perimeter, each detonation part of a carefully planned sequence designed to systematically destroy the checkpoint's defensive capabilities. "This is it," Morrison's voice cut through the chaos on the radio. "All positions, prepare for ground assault. They're coming with everything they have." Elena could hear the difference immediately. The incoming fire was more accurate, more sustained, and more professional than previous attacks. Intelligence reports had suggested that insurgent forces had been reinforced with foreign fighters and heavy weapons, and the evidence was brutally apparent in the precision of their assault. As the artillery lifted, Elena prepared to move to her designated position in the aid station, but Ferris caught her attention with urgent gestures toward the eastern perimeter. Through the smoke and dust, she could see figures in combat gear advancing through gaps that had been blown in the defensive wire. "Breach in Sector East," she radioed to Morrison. "Multiple infiltrators moving toward ammunition bunker." The response was immediate. Tank's heavy machine gun began laying down suppressive fire while Crow engaged individual targets with precise rifle shots. But Elena could see that the enemy advance was too well coordinated to be stopped by defensive fire alone. They needed immediate counteraction to prevent the infiltrators from reaching critical infrastructure. "Ahmad," she called to her assistant, forgetting for a moment that he'd been evacuated for medical treatment the previous day. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her most trusted partner wasn't available for the most crucial battle they'd faced. But Ferris stepped forward immediately. "I go," he said in careful English. "I know the route. I know the targets." Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second. Ferris was a skilled medic but lacked Ahmad's combat training and tactical experience. Sending him into direct combat felt like asking him to sacrifice himself for a mission that might fail anyway. "Too dangerous," she said. "More dangerous if they reach ammunition," Ferris replied with simple logic that Elena couldn't argue against. The infiltration was stopped, but at a terrible cost. Ferris succeeded in guiding a small team to intercept the enemy advance, but he was wounded in the process, a bullet through the thigh that would require immediate surgery to prevent permanent damage. Elena found herself treating her friend and surgery to prevent permanent damage. Medical partner while enemy forces continued their assault from multiple directions. The irony wasn't lost on her. The relationships she'd built were now the source of both tactical advantages and personal anguish, as people she cared about were wounded or killed defending their shared position. How bad? Ferris asked through gritted teeth as Elena worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize his leg. Bad enough that you're done fighting for today, Elena replied. Good enough that you'll walk again if we can get you proper medical treatment. But proper medical treatment required evacuation that wasn't possible under current conditions. Enemy forces had positioned anti-aircraft weapons specifically to prevent helicopter operations, making Elena's aid station the only medical facility available for critically wounded soldiers. The next 6 hours tested every skill Elena had developed as both a medic and a tactical leader. Casualties mounted steadily as insurgent forces maintained pressure from multiple directions, probing for weaknesses while gradually advancing their positions. Closer to the checkpoint's defensive perimeter, she found herself moving constantly between wounded soldiers, making triage decisions that would have been unthinkable in civilian medicine. Some soldiers with survivable wounds had to wait for treatment while she focused on cases where immediate intervention meant the difference between life and death. Martinez, Morrison's voice cut through her headset during a brief lull in the fighting. I need you at position 4. Multiple casualties, possible chemical exposure. Elena felt her blood run cold. Chemical weapons represented a level of escalation that could turn an already desperate situation into a complete disaster. She grabbed her specialized equipment and prepared to move, but Ferris caught her arm despite his wounds. Take extra atropine, he said urgently. If it is nerve agent, you will need much more than standard dosage. Ferris's civilian experience as a pharmacist was proving invaluable under combat conditions, providing medical knowledge that complemented Elena's emergency medicine training. She loaded her bag with additional antidotes and protective equipment before making the dangerous sprint to position 4. She found a scene of controlled chaos. 3 soldiers showing symptoms of chemical exposure, Chun trying to establish a security perimeter while dealing with unknown contamination, and Doc attempting to provide medical treatment without proper protective equipment. Elena's assessment was rapid but thorough. The symptoms were consistent with chlorine gas exposure, serious, but treatable with proper intervention. More importantly, the exposure was localized rather than part of a larger chemical attack, suggesting that insurgent forces had improvised a chemical weapon from industrial materials, rather than deploying military-grade agents. Chlorine gas, she reported to Morrison while beginning treatment. Localized exposure, probably from an improvised device. Not immediately life-threatening if we treat aggressively. The next hour was spent in intensive medical treatment under combat conditions, with Elena administering oxygen and anti-inflammatory medications while Chun and Doc maintained security around the contaminated area. All 3 affected soldiers survived, but the incident highlighted the escalating sophistication of insurgent tactics. They're learning, Morrison observed during his evening briefing. Each attack is more complex, more dangerous, more difficult to defend against. Elena nodded grimly. The enemy's learning curve was accelerating faster than their own ability to adapt, creating a tactical situation that favored the attackers despite the defenders' advantages in position and cooperation. What about reinforcements? Chun asked. Still 48 hours out, Morrison replied. Command says the situation is too fluid to risk major forces, but they're trying to get us artillery support and medical evacuation capability. Elena felt a surge of frustration. The checkpoint was holding against overwhelming odds, but barely. and the promise of eventual support felt increasingly hollow as casualties mounted and resources dwindled. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "what if we don't wait for support?" "What?" "If we take the initiative again." Morrison looked at her suspiciously. "We tried that approach yesterday, Martinez. It worked, but barely, and now we're facing the consequences." "The consequences of success," Elena pointed out. "We disrupted their command structure and captured valuable intelligence. Maybe we can do it again." "With what forces?" Morrison asked bluntly. "We've got wounded soldiers, limited ammunition, and an enemy that's learned from our previous tactics." Elena had been thinking about this problem throughout the day's fighting, weighing the risks of aggressive action against the certainty of defeat if they remained purely defensive. "We use what they don't expect," she said slowly. "Local knowledge, unconventional tactics, and the kind of cooperation they can't replicate." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering her proposal. "What exactly are you thinking?" "A night raid," Elena replied. "Small teams, multiple targets, designed to create maximum confusion and disruption. But this time, we use local soldiers as primary leaders, with American forces providing support and heavy weapons." Chun looked up from her map with obvious interest. "Role reversal," she said thoughtfully. "They expect us to use locals as guides and Americans as assault leaders. If we flip that dynamic, it might catch them off guard." Morrison studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind of a professional. "Soldier." Elena could see him calculating ammunition expenditures, casualty probabilities, and mission requirements, while weighing them against their deteriorating defensive situation. "It's a hell of a risk," he said finally. "If we lose people on an offensive operation, we won't have enough left to defend this position. If we don't take risks, we're going to lose this position anyway," Elena countered. "At least this way, we're fighting on our own terms instead of just reacting to their initiatives." The argument was interrupted by urgent radio traffic from Coalition Command. Surveillance assets had detected large-scale enemy movement throughout the sector, with multiple insurgent units converging on Checkpoint Charlie from all directions. The intelligence suggested that the enemy was planning a final, overwhelming assault designed to eliminate the checkpoint completely. "Looks like the decision's been made for us," Morrison said grimly. "We can try your raid before they hit us. Or we can sit here and wait for them to bring everything they have." Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but this time it was shared with the local soldiers who'd become her partners and friends. Whatever they decided, they would implement together with shared risks and shared consequences. "I think we should try," she said quietly. Morrison looked around at the faces of soldiers who'd survived weeks of escalating combat through courage, skill, and the kind of teamwork that transcended national boundaries. "All right," he decided. "We'll try it your way one more time. But this is our last chance. If this fails, we don't have the resources for another attempt." Elena felt her heart rate increase with anticipation and fear. The raid she was proposing would test everything she'd learned about leadership, medicine, and human nature under the ultimate stress of combat. But as she looked at the faces of soldiers who'd become more than allies, she felt confident that whatever challenges they faced, they would meet them together. The next 12 hours would determine whether the relationship she'd built and the integrated approach she'd championed could generate enough tactical advantage to overcome overwhelming odds. But Elena knew that regardless of the outcome, she'd proven something important about the power of human connection in the face of ultimate adversity. The raid was scheduled for 0200 hours, but events forced an earlier timeline when enemy artillery began falling at midnight with unprecedented accuracy and intensity. Elena found herself treating casualties from the bombardment while simultaneously preparing for an offensive operation that might be their only chance of survival. "They're using the artillery to pin us down while they move assault forces into position," Morrison reported grimly. We've got maybe 2 hours before they hit us with everything they have. Elena's medical station had become a scene of controlled urgency, with wounded soldiers from multiple positions requiring immediate treatment while she prepared supplies for the upcoming raid. Ferris, despite his leg wound, insisted on helping with medical preparations, his pharmaceutical knowledge proving crucial for managing pain medications and combat stimulants. "Take this," Ferris said, handing Elena a small bottle of pills, dextroamphetamine medical grade, for extreme exhaustion when lives depend on alertness. Elena looked at the medication with professional understanding. Combat stimulants were controversial in military medicine, but in situations where fatigue could mean death for entire units, they represented a calculated risk that might be worth taking. "How many casualties can you handle here if I'm gone for the raid?" she asked Ferris. "Many," he replied simply. "You taught me well, and Doc will be here to assist." Elena felt a surge of pride in Ferris's development as a combat medic, but also deep concern about leaving the checkpoint's medical care in the hands of someone who was himself wounded and working with limited supplies. The sound of incoming helicopters interrupted her thoughts, not the enemy aircraft they'd been expecting, but American birds flying nap of the Earth approaches that kept them below enemy radar coverage. "Medevac flight," Morrison announced over the radio. "They're going to try to extract our most critical casualties before the situation gets worse." Elena felt a moment of hope, but it was quickly tempered by tactical reality. The helicopters could only evacuate a few soldiers, and the selection process would require making agonizing choices about who was critical enough to justify the risks of flight operations under fire. "Martinez," Morrison called over the radio, "I need you to make triage decisions for evacuation. Medical priority, only no other considerations." Elena understood what Morrison was really asking. She had to decide which wounded soldiers were most likely to die without immediate evacuation, regardless of their nationality, rank, or tactical importance. It was purely medical decision-making, but with consequences that extended far beyond individual patient care. The process took 20 minutes of rapid assessment and difficult choices. Elena selected 4 soldiers for evacuation. Santos, who was stable but needed surgery for his abdominal wound. Ahmad, whose concussion required neurological monitoring, unavailable at the checkpoint. A local soldier with severe chest trauma. And Ferris, whose leg wound was becoming infected despite antibiotic treatment. "I stay," Ferris protested when Elena told him about the evacuation decision. "My soldiers need medical care." "Your soldiers need you alive and healthy," Elena countered. "That infection will kill you if it's not treated properly, and then they'll have no medic at all." The argument was brief but intense, with Ferris's dedication to his comrades conflicting with Elena's medical judgment and concern for his survival. The resolution came when Lieutenant Hakim personally ordered Ferris to accept evacuation, pointing out that dead medics couldn't save lives. As the helicopters lifted off with their precious cargo of wounded soldiers, Elena felt a complex mixture of relief and loss. The evacuation had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost, but it had also removed some of her closest allies from the final battle that was approaching. "Ready for the raid?" Morrison asked, approaching Elena as she finished reorganizing her medical supplies. Elena looked around at the remaining forces: 3 American soldiers from Alpha Squad, 12 local fighters led by a sergeant named Malik, who'd emerged as Ahmad's replacement, and herself. It was a small force to attempt offensive operations against an enemy that outnumbered them at least 5 to 1. "Ready," she said simply. The raid plan was necessarily simple given their limited resources and time constraints. 3 small teams would hit different targets simultaneously. Morrison would lead an attack on the enemy's forward command post. Shun would assault their ammunition dump, and Elena would accompany Malik's team in an attack on the communications center that was coordinating the artillery bombardment. "Remember," Morrison said during their final briefing, This isn't about winning a decisive victory. We're trying to create enough confusion and disruption to delay their main assault until reinforcements arrive. Elena understood the plan's limitations, but she also recognized its potential. If successful, the raids might buy them the 12 to 18 hours necessary for coalition reinforcements to reach their position. But as they prepared to move out, the checkpoint's radio operator reported alarming intelligence from Coalition Command. Enemy forces were larger and better equipped than initially assessed, with multiple companies converging on Checkpoint Charlie from all directions. The reinforcements Elena had been counting on were still at least 24 hours away. So we hold for 24 hours instead of 12. Elena said factly. Morrison looked at her with something approaching admiration. You really think we can do this? Elena considered the question seriously. Their situation was objectively desperate, outnumbered, low on ammunition, facing professional enemy forces with limited hope of timely reinforcement. But they also had advantages that couldn't be quantified in traditional military terms. The trust and cooperation between American and local forces, intimate knowledge of terrain and tactics, and the kind of motivation that came from fighting for something larger than personal survival. I think we can try, she said finally, and sometimes trying is enough. The raids launched at 0230 hours under cover of a diversionary artillery barrage that Coalition Command had managed to coordinate. Despite the tactical situation, Elena found herself moving through familiar terrain that had been transformed by weeks of combat into a landscape of craters, damaged buildings, and improvised fortifications. Malik proved to be an effective leader whose tactical skills matched his predecessors, guiding Elena's team through enemy positions with the confidence of someone fighting to defend his homeland. The other local soldiers moved with professional discipline, their equipment and training now indistinguishable from regular military forces. Communications center ahead, Malik whispered, pointing to a cluster of antennas and electronic equipment that had been set up in a damaged school building. Elena studied the target through her night vision scope. The enemy position was well defended but not impregnable, with obvious fields of fire that could be neutralized by coordinated assault. More importantly, destroying the communications center would disrupt the artillery coordination that had been making their defensive position untenable. The assault was executed with precision that reflected weeks of training and shared combat experience. Elena found herself providing medical support while engaging enemy positions with her rifle, skills that would have seemed contradictory in civilian medicine but that represented necessary adaptation to combat conditions. The communications center was destroyed within 15 minutes, with valuable equipment captured and enemy personnel eliminated or scattered. But success came at a cost. One of Malik's soldiers was killed in the assault, and Elena herself suffered a minor shrapnel wound that would require attention once they returned to the checkpoint. Objective secured, Elena radioed to Morrison. Enemy communications disrupted, equipment destroyed. Outstanding, Morrison replied. Chun's team has hit their target too. Enemy coordination is breaking down. But as Elena's team prepared to withdraw from their objective, they encountered unexpected resistance. Enemy forces that had been held in reserve were moving to reinforce positions that had come under attack, creating the possibility of Elena's team being trapped between hostile forces. Multiple enemy squads converging on our position, Malik reported calmly. Withdrawal route compromised. Elena assessed their tactical situation rapidly. They were outnumbered and potentially surrounded, with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement. But they also had advantages: intimate knowledge of the terrain, enemy communications that had been disrupted by their successful raid, and the kind of teamwork that had been forged through shared danger and mutual respect. There's another way out, Elena said, remembering conversations with Ahmad about alternative routes through the damaged urban terrain. Sewage system leads directly back to checkpoint perimeter. The withdrawal through underground passages proved even more challenging than their previous tunnel experiences, with Elena treating wounded soldiers while navigating through spaces that hadn't been designed for human movement. But the route worked, bringing them back to Checkpoint Charlie without further casualties. The other raid teams reported similar success. Morrison had disrupted enemy command structures. Chun had destroyed significant ammunition supplies, and the overall effect had been to delay and confuse the planned insurgent assault. But victory was temporary. As dawn approached, coalition surveillance assets reported that enemy forces were regrouping faster than anticipated, with reinforcements arriving to replace losses and restore command capabilities. "They'll hit us again within 6 hours," Morrison reported after reviewing the latest intelligence. "And this time, they'll be ready for our tactics." Elena felt exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket, but underneath the fatigue was something else, a sense of completion that came from having tested herself under ultimate conditions and discovering reserves of strength and capability she hadn't known existed. "So we'll be ready for theirs," she said simply. As Checkpoint Charlie prepared for what might be its final battle, Elena realized that regardless of the outcome, she'd proven something important about herself and the soldiers she'd come to care about. The soft heart that her squad mates had once mocked had become the foundation for tactical advantages that no amount of conventional military training could have provided. The next few hours would test everything she'd learned about courage, compassion, and the bonds that united soldiers facing overwhelming odds. But Elena felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that she would face it alongside people who'd become more than allies. They'd become family. We're approaching the climactic moments of this epic tale, and the tension is at its peak. Creating stories of this scope and detail requires not just writing talent, but careful plotting, character development, and attention to every narrative thread. We've journeyed through nearly 40,000 words together, and I hope every moment has kept you engaged. If this story has drawn you in and kept you listening, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Share this epic with anyone who loves immersive storytelling, and hit that notification bell for more incredible adventures. Now let's witness how everything comes together in these final crucial moments. The attack began with a synchronized artillery barrage that lasted 45 minutes longer and more intense than anything Checkpoint Charlie had previously endured. Elena found herself crammed into the deepest bunker with Doc and 6 wounded local soldiers, listening to explosions that seemed to be tearing the earth itself apart above their heads. When the barrage finally lifted, the silence felt almost as oppressive as the noise had been. Elena's ears were ringing, her hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, but her mind was clear with the kind of focused calm that came from accepting that she might not survive the next few hours. "All positions report," Morrison's voice cut through the radio static. The responses were sobering. Position 2 had taken a direct hit that killed 2 soldiers and wounded 3 more. Position 4 was temporarily abandoned due to structural damage. Position 5 reported that tank was unconscious from a concussion but still breathing. "Martinez, I need you at Position 2 immediately," Morrison commanded. "Multiple critical casualties." Elena grabbed her medical bag and prepared to move, but Doc caught her arm. "Elena," he said seriously, using her first name, "the checkpoint's perimeter has been breached in 3 places. Moving between positions isn't just dangerous anymore, it's probably suicidal." Elena looked at the faces of wounded soldiers around. Her men she'd come to know personally, whose families and dreams she'd learned about during quiet moments between battles. The thought of leaving them without medical care while she treated other casualties felt like abandoning her fundamental responsibilities as a medic. "I can't stay here while other people are dying," she said simply. Doc studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Then I'm going with you. These guys are stable enough to wait 20 minutes. The journey to Position 2 became a running battle, through terrain that had been transformed into a moonscape of craters and rubble. Enemy forces had advanced close enough to the checkpoint's perimeter that small arms fire was now a constant threat, requiring Elena and Doc to move in short sprints between covered positions. They found Position 2 in ruins, with Malik and 2 other local soldiers strapped under debris from the collapsed fighting position. All 3 men were conscious but pinned by concrete and steel that would require careful extraction to avoid causing additional injuries. Elena's assessment was rapid but thorough. Malik had a possible spinal injury that could be worsened by improper movement. 1 soldier had a compound fracture of his left arm. The 3rd was suffering from internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. "We need to extract them carefully," Elena told Doc. "But we also need to do it fast. I can hear enemy forces getting closer." The next 30 minutes represented some of the most challenging medical work of Elena's career. Working under fire, with limited equipment and constant time pressure, she had to stabilize 3 seriously injured soldiers while preparing them for movement through a combat zone. The soldier with internal bleeding was her greatest concern. He needed surgery within the hour to survive, but moving him to the aid station would require carrying him across open ground under enemy observation. Elena found herself making the kind of impossible medical decisions that haunted combat medics: treat him extensively at their current position and risk being overrun by enemy forces, or move him quickly and risk killing him through improper handling of his injuries. "We move," she decided. "I'll treat him as we go." The evacuation became a moving medical emergency, with Elena providing 4 fluids and monitoring vital signs while Doc and a local soldier carried the wounded man through rubble-strewn terrain under sporadic enemy fire. But when they reached the aid station, Elena discovered that the situation at Checkpoint Charlie had deteriorated beyond anything she'd previously experienced. Enemy forces had broken through the perimeter in multiple locations, turning the defensive positions into isolated pockets of resistance that were being systematically eliminated. "The checkpoint's falling," Morrison reported over the radio. "All units prepare for final defensive positions." Elena felt a moment of despair that was quickly replaced by professional determination. The checkpoint might be falling, but wounded soldiers still needed medical care, and she would continue treating them until she was physically unable to do so. The aid station had become a scene of organized chaos, with wounded soldiers from multiple positions requiring treatment, while enemy forces advanced to within 100 meters of their location. Elena found herself working with supplies that were running dangerously low, making triage decisions that would have been unthinkable in civilian medicine. "Martinez," Chun's voice cut through her headset. "I'm bringing in Tank and Crow. Both are ambulatory but need immediate treatment." Elena looked around her aid station, counting available space and medical supplies against the number of casualties that required treatment. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. She had resources for perhaps 6 more critical patients, but casualties were arriving faster than she could treat them. Tank arrived with a concussion, severe enough to affect his vision and coordination, while Crow had taken shrapnel to his chest that missed his heart by inches but caused significant bleeding. Both soldiers were conscious and alert, but needed medical attention that Elena wasn't sure she could provide given her dwindling supplies. "How bad is the tactical situation?" Elena asked Chun while working on Tank's head injury. "Bad as it gets," Chun replied honestly. "We're down to maybe 15 effective fighters, ammunition is critically low, and enemy forces have us surrounded. Command estimates another 2 hours before reinforcements arrive." 2 hours felt like an eternity given their current situation. Elena realized that traditional defensive tactics were no longer viable. They needed something radical if anyone was going to survive the next few hours. "What if we break out?" she asked. Chun looked at her as if she'd suggested something insane. Break out to where? We're surrounded by at least a company of enemy forces, and half our people are wounded. Elena had been thinking about this possibility throughout the day's fighting, weighing the risks of abandoning their defensive position against the certainty of death if they stayed. The Wadi system north of here, she said. Ahmad showed it to me during our first week. Natural concealment, multiple exit routes, and terrain that favors small units over large ones. You're talking about evacuating wounded soldiers through a combat zone while under pursuit by superior enemy forces, Chun said flatly. That's not a breakout, that's a death march. Elena understood Chun's concerns, but she also understood that their current position was becoming untenable. Enemy forces were close enough that artillery and air support would be ineffective even if it were available, and ammunition shortages meant that sustained defensive fire was no longer possible. What's the alternative? Elena asked. Stay here. And die when they overrun us? Before Chun could respond, Morrison's voice cut through the radio with an urgent update. All positions. Enemy forces are massing for final assault. Estimate 15 minutes before they hit us with everything they have. Elena felt time compressing around her like a closing fist. 15 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether any of them survived the next few hours. 15 minutes to organize an evacuation of wounded soldiers through enemy territory. With limited medical supplies and no guarantee of success. I'm going to recommend the breakout to Morrison, she told Chun. It's risky, but it's better than certain death. Chun was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing tactical options that all involved significant risks. If we do this, she said finally, it has to be completely coordinated. American and local forces working together completely, with no separate command structures or competing priorities. Elena felt a surge of hope. Chun's support meant that the breakout had a chance of success, but only if they could execute it with the kind of precision and cooperation that they'd been building over weeks of shared combat. Morrison, Elena called over the radio. Request permission to speak with you immediately about tactical options. Morrison's response was immediate. Negative, Martinez. All personnel maintain positions for final defense. Elena felt frustration building in her chest, but she understood Morrison's reasoning. From a traditional military perspective, abandoning defensive positions under enemy fire was tantamount to suicide. But Elena's perspective had been shaped by different considerations: medical necessity, relationship dynamics, and intimate knowledge of terrain that conventional military doctrine couldn't account for. Sergeant, she said firmly into her radio, I'm coming to your position. We need to discuss this face to face. The sprint to Morrison's command post was the most dangerous movement Elena had made during the entire siege. Enemy forces were close enough that she could hear individual voices calling tactical commands, close enough that muzzle flashes seemed to be coming from every direction simultaneously. She found Morrison coordinating the final defense with the calm professionalism of a career soldier who'd accepted that he might not survive the next hour. His tactical assessment was thorough and realistic. Insufficient ammunition for sustained defense, inadequate cover against concentrated assault, and enemy forces that outnumbered them by at least 4-1. We're out of options, Martinez, Morrison said, without looking up from his map. The best we can do is sell our lives as expensively as possible and hope reinforcements arrive in time to extract whoever's left. Elena looked at the tactical situation. From her unique perspective, part medic, part soldier, part cultural bridge between American forces and local allies who'd become family. The conventional assessment was accurate, but incomplete because it failed to account for advantages that couldn't be quantified in traditional military terms. Sergeant, she said quietly, what if our soft hearts are actually our greatest strength? Morrison looked up at her with surprise. What do you mean? The relationships we've built, the trust between our forces and local soldiers, The intimate knowledge of terrain that comes from fighting alongside people who call this place home. What if those advantages are worth more than ammunition counts? And force ratios? For the first time since the siege began, Morrison's expression showed something other than grim determination. Elena could see him processing her words, weighing intangible factors against conventional military calculations. "You're talking about the Wadi breakout," he said slowly. "I'm talking about survival," Elena replied, "for all of us." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, listening to radio reports of advancing enemy forces while considering options that all involved terrible risks. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that would determine who lived and who died in the next few hours. "All right, Martinez," he said. "We'll try it your way one last time." Elena felt her heart rate spike with anticipation and terror. The breakout operation would test everything she'd learned about leadership, medicine, and human connection under the ultimate pressure of life or death combat. But as she prepared to coordinate the most dangerous mission of her military career, she felt certain that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The next chapter would reveal whether her soft heart could generate enough tactical advantage to save lives that conventional military doctrine had already written off as casualties of war. The breakout began at 0347 hours, just as enemy forces launched their final assault on Checkpoint Charlie's remaining defensive positions. Elena found herself leading a mixed group of American and local soldiers through terrain that Ahmad had described weeks earlier during one of their training sessions. Wadi system that provided natural concealment but also funneled movement into predictable routes that could easily become killing zones. 8 wounded soldiers requiring evacuation, Elena radioed to Morrison as they began their movement. 2 critical, 6 ambulatory with assistance. The numbers were both encouraging and terrifying. 8 soldiers whose lives depended on her medical knowledge and tactical leadership, but also 8 additional personnel who would slow their movement and require protection during a journey that was already extremely dangerous. Tank and Crow, despite their injuries, insisted on providing rear security as the evacuation group moved through the Wadi. Both soldiers were operating on a combination of morphine, determination, and the kind of loyalty that made men fight effectively despite personal wounds that should have disabled them. "I can walk," Tank insisted, his concussion making his speech slightly slurred but his tactical awareness still sharp. "I can shoot. I can cover our movement. That's what matters." Elena had learned to respect the judgment of wounded soldiers who understood their own capabilities better than external medical assessment could determine. Tank's condition was serious but not immediately life-threatening, and his heavy weapons expertise would be crucial if they encountered enemy forces during the evacuation. The most challenging case was Malik, whose spinal injury required careful handling to prevent permanent paralysis. Elena had improvised a stretcher from damaged equipment, but carrying him through rough terrain while maintaining tactical alertness was pushing the limits of what their small group could accomplish. "How much farther to the extraction point?" Doc asked, his voice strained from the effort of carrying medical equipment while assisting with wounded soldiers. Elena consulted the map Ahmad had sketched for her during their terrain discussions. 2 kilometers through the Wadi, then another kilometer across open ground to reach coalition lines. The distances seemed manageable in theory, but Elena knew that combat movement was measured not just in meters, but in time under fire, energy, expenditure, and the accumulated stress of carrying wounded comrades through hostile territory. They reached the halfway point without enemy contact, but Elena could hear radio traffic indicating that insurgent forces had discovered their escape route and were moving to intercept them. The tactical situation was becoming a race. Could they reach safety before enemy forces could position themselves to block the evacuation? "Contact front," Crow's voice cut through the radio traffic. "Enemy squad moving to block our route, approximately 400 meters ahead." Elena felt her stomach clench with familiar pre-combat anxiety, but her mind remained focused on the immediate medical and tactical requirements. 8 wounded soldiers depended on her leadership, and failure meant death not just for herself, but for men who'd become more than patients. They'd become family. "Chun, take half the group around the eastern approach," Morrison commanded. "Martinez, you stay with the wounded and continue through the wadi. We'll clear the blocking force and rejoin you at the extraction point." Elena understood the tactical logic, but separating their small force in the face of enemy contact felt like abandoning the integrated approach that had kept them alive through weeks of combat. "Negative," she replied. "We stay together. The wounded can provide covering fire from concealed positions, while assault teams clear the blocking force." Morrison's response was immediate and sharp. "Martinez, wounded soldiers don't engage in assault operations. That's not how military medicine works." "It's how survival works," Elena countered. "These soldiers are wounded, not dead. They can still contribute to mission success." The argument was settled by Tank, whose heavy machine gun began laying down suppressive fire that forced the enemy blocking force to take cover. Despite his concussion and shrapnel wounds, his marksmanship was precise enough to give the evacuation group time to maneuver into better positions. "See," Elena said to Morrison, "wounded doesn't mean useless." The firefight that followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced during her military career. Fighting alongside soldiers who should have been patients, providing medical treatment, while engaging enemy positions, coordinating movement through terrain that offered both concealment and deadly exposure. But the integrated approach proved its worth once again. Local soldiers' intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed them to outmaneuver enemy forces despite being outnumbered and burdened with casualties. American weapons and communications provided capabilities that enemy forces couldn't match. Most importantly, the trust and cooperation between all participants generated tactical advantages that couldn't be quantified in conventional military terms. The enemy blocking force was eliminated within 20 minutes, but Elena knew that their gunfire had revealed their position to other insurgent units in the area. They had perhaps 30 minutes before superior enemy forces would converge on their location, making speed as important as stealth for the remainder of their evacuation. "Movement, movement," Morrison commanded, and the evacuation group resumed their desperate journey toward coalition lines. The final kilometer proved to be the most dangerous part of their journey. Open ground that offered no concealment, with wounded soldiers who were approaching the limits of their endurance. While enemy forces closed in from multiple directions, Elena found herself making real-time medical decisions while under fire. Which wounded soldiers could continue without assistance, which required additional pain medication to maintain mobility, which were approaching medical conditions that would make further movement dangerous regardless of tactical circumstances. "I can't go farther," one of the local soldiers whispered, his leg wound having reopened during the movement. "Leave me, save the others." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the same selfless courage that had characterized every soldier she'd worked with during their time at Checkpoint Charlie. But she also saw medical assessment. The wound was serious but treatable, and abandoning him would mean certain death when enemy forces found him. "Nobody gets left behind," she said firmly. "That's not how this works." The final approach to coalition lines required crossing a minefield that had been emplaced weeks earlier to prevent insurgent infiltration. Elena found herself leading 8 wounded soldiers through terrain where a single misplaced footstep could kill them all, using techniques that Ahmad had taught her but had never been tested under combat conditions. "Follow my exact footsteps," she instructed the group. "Stay in single file, maintain visual contact with the person ahead of you, and trust the route." The journey through the minefield felt like an eternity compressed into 20 minutes. Each step required careful placement. Each pause brought them closer to enemy forces that were pursuing them. Each moment tested Elena's leadership and medical skills under ultimate pressure. When they finally reached coalition lines, Elena collapsed from exhaustion and relief. 8 wounded soldiers had survived an evacuation that conventional military doctrine would have considered impossible. More importantly, they'd survived because of relationships and trust that transcended traditional boundaries between medic and patient, American and local forces, individual survival and collective responsibility. Martinez, Morrison said as medics from the coalition base began treating their casualties. What you did back there, that was something special. Elena looked back at the terrain they'd crossed, thinking about the soldiers they'd lost and the ones they'd saved, about the relationships that had made survival possible and the trust that had carried them through impossible circumstances. It wasn't just me, she said quietly. It was all of us working together. That's what made it possible. As evacuation helicopters arrived to transport the wounded to proper medical facilities, Elena realized that her time at Checkpoint Charlie had taught her something crucial about the nature of courage and compassion under extreme conditions. Her soft heart hadn't been a weakness to overcome, it had been a strength to embrace, a foundation for the kind of leadership that could save lives when conventional approaches failed. The final test was over, but the lessons would last a lifetime. 6 months later, Elena Martinez stood in the rehabilitation ward of Walter Reed Medical Center, watching Ahmed take his first steps since the surgery that had repaired the brain injury he'd suffered during the final battle for Checkpoint Charlie. His recovery had been slow but complete, and his determination to return to active duty reflected the same courage that had made him an invaluable partner during their time in combat. The doctors say I can return to my unit next month, Ahmad said in English that had improved dramatically during his medical treatment. But first, I want to thank you properly for saving my life. Elena felt the familiar mixture of pride and humility that came from successful patient outcomes. Ahmad's survival had required not just medical treatment, but the kind of trust and cooperation that had defined their entire experience at the checkpoint. You saved your own life, Elena replied. I just provided the medical support. Ahmad smiled, with the warmth that had made him such an effective bridge between American and local forces. You provided much more than medical support. You provided hope when everything seemed hopeless. Elena walked through the rehabilitation ward, visiting other soldiers who'd been wounded during the siege of Checkpoint Charlie. Ferris was recovering from the infection that had nearly killed him, his leg wound healing well enough that he would return to full duty. Tank was dealing with the long-term effects of his concussion, but maintaining the determined optimism that had made him such an effective heavy weapons specialist. Softheart comes to visit, Tank said with a grin that held none of the mockery that had characterized his earlier use of the nickname. How's civilian life treating you? Elena had been discharged from active duty 2 months earlier, her service record reflecting commendations for medical excellence and leadership under combat conditions. The transition to civilian life had been difficult, but she'd found purpose in working with veterans who were dealing with physical and psychological wounds from their combat experiences. Complicated, Elena admitted, but worthwhile. How's physical therapy going? Slow but steady, Tank replied. Doc says the headache should fade eventually, and the coordination problems are getting better. I'll be back to fighting weight before too long. Elena spent the afternoon visiting wounded soldiers, providing informal counseling and medical advice to men who'd become family during their shared ordeal. Each conversation reinforced lessons she'd learned about the importance of human connection in healing and recovery. But the most meaningful visit was with Morrison, who was recovering from wounds suffered during the final evacuation from Checkpoint Charlie. The squad leader had been hit by shrapnel during the rearguard action that had allowed Elena's group to escape, and his injuries had required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. Martinez, Morrison said as Elena entered his room. I've been hoping you'd visit. Elena settled into a chair beside his bed, noting the medical charts that indicated he was recovering well, but would require additional surgery to repair nerve damage in his left arm. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" "Better every day," Morrison replied. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about." "I wanted to apologize." Elena looked at him with surprise. "Apologize for what?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "For not understanding what you were trying to accomplish at the checkpoint. For questioning your methods and your priorities. For not recognizing that your soft heart was exactly what the situation required." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with professional validation. Morrison's approval meant more than any official commendation, because it came from someone who'd witnessed her performance under ultimate pressure. "You were doing your job," Elena said simply. "Keeping the squad alive and mission-focused. That's what good leaders do." "Good leaders also recognize when their understanding is incomplete," Morrison replied. "What you accomplished at that checkpoint, the relationships you built, the trust you created, the tactical advantages you generated, that wasn't just good medicine. That was good leadership." Elena thought about the lessons she'd learned during her time at Checkpoint Charlie, that medical care was inseparable from human connection, that tactical effectiveness often depended on relationships that transcended traditional military boundaries, that courage came in many forms, but was most powerful when expressed through service to others. "I learned as much from you and the squad as you learned from me," Elena said. "Maybe more." Morrison smiled with genuine warmth. "That's what made it work. We all learned from each other." Elena's final visit was to the memorial wall in the hospital's main lobby, where photographs honored soldiers who died during operations throughout the region. She found the pictures of soldiers from Checkpoint Charlie who hadn't survived. Yusuf, the local soldier who died during the first major assault. 3 other local fighters who'd been killed during subsequent battles. And 1 American soldier from another unit who'd died during the evacuation operations. Standing before their photographs, Elena felt the familiar mixture of grief and gratitude that defined her relationship with combat medicine. Grief for lives that couldn't be saved despite everyone's best efforts. Gratitude for lives that had been preserved through skill, courage, and the kind of human connection that made survival possible under impossible circumstances. They didn't die for nothing, she said quietly, speaking to the photographs as much as to herself. Their sacrifice made it possible for others to survive. As Elena left Walter Reed and drove toward her new job at a veterans medical center, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a civilian paramedic with doubts about her military calling to a combat veteran, whose experience had fundamentally changed her understanding of medicine and leadership. Her soft heart hadn't been a weakness to overcome, it had been a strength to embrace. The compassion that had driven her to enlist, the relationships she'd built with soldiers from different cultures and backgrounds, the trust that had made tactical cooperation possible under extreme pressure, all of these had emerged from her fundamental belief that every life had value, and that medical care was inseparable from human dignity. The critics had been wrong about Elena Martinez. They'd laughed at her soft heart until she'd carried 8 wounded men through a minefield, demonstrating that compassion and courage weren't contradictory forces, but complementary aspects of the same fundamental commitment to service. Elena's story had become part of military medical doctrine, studied in training programs and referenced in leadership courses. But for Elena herself, the real validation came from letters she received from soldiers she'd treated, updates on their recovery and their families, expressions of gratitude that reminded her why she'd chosen medicine as her calling. Driving through the Virginia countryside toward her new assignment, Elena thought about the future and the veterans she would work with in her civilian practice. Each patient would bring their own story of service and sacrifice, their own struggles with physical and psychological wounds, their own need for medical care, that recognized their humanity as much as their pathology. Elena Martinez had learned that the strongest hearts were often the softest ones. That true courage was measured not by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to act despite it, and that the bonds forged through shared adversity could transcend any boundary that separated one human being from another. Her soft heart had proven to be exactly what the world needed. What an absolutely incredible journey we've shared together. A full 50,000 words of adventure, character growth, and storytelling. Creating a story of this magnitude requires months of planning, writing, and careful narration to ensure every detail is perfect and every moment keeps you engaged. This has been the equivalent of a complete novella, crafted specifically for this format. If this epic story moved you, inspired you, or simply entertained you through this incredible journey, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more amazing long-form stories. Share this with anyone who loves compelling narratives and has the patience for truly epic storytelling. Hit that notification bell to be the first to hear our newest content. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community and for joining me on this remarkable adventure. I'll see you in the next incredible tale.